We had a great conversation just a few months ago on the grand challenges of healthcare AI and had a lot of great responses, a lot of inbound questions and comments. So we figured we'd channel some of that inbound into another conversation. There were basically three main clusters of questions that came in. One was around the cost of both healthcare and the implementation of AI. We had another set of questions around the data landscape of AI training. And then the last piece was around patient experience. A lot of questions about how is this going to impact us as consumers. So let's start with cost. So Vijay, the first question that came in was, does AI have the potential to lower healthcare costs? And if so, how?
Yeah, so this is fun, right? And so you can start by talking about what do we mean by cost. So if we're talking about fee-for-service cost, then the question is, can you bring down the cost of the services? And that's one thing you can imagine AI doing, in that in terms of cost of professionals' time, doctors, nurses, and so on, to the extent AI can augment that and do things in lieu of them, and maybe things that the doctor could do, but we could actually give to AI because it's not diagnosing or not prescribing or something like that. That should bring down cost, even in the fee-for-service sense. Whether that cost gets sort of sent back to the payers or the patients or something like that is a longer discussion. But from an intellectual point of view, that'll bring down cost. But the big win, as I think about it, is like in the sort of value-based care sense, like in the sort of not the sick care fee-for-service sense, but in the truly keeping us healthy sense. If AI can get out in front of things, then hopefully, we decrease hospitalizations, readmissions, all these things. And that would really be saving the system. I think that's where the big win is in that value-based care. But now we get sort of trapped into the value-based world.
Yeah.
And so how do we get that? And actually, therefore, AI plays into the sort of the tailwinds for value-based, but also maybe some of the headwinds.
Yeah, so you're basically making the case that, number one, there's just sort of like a unit cost of labor argument of how AI can impact cost structure. And then another around AI as applied to preventative services to basically get ahead of clinical escalations, so to speak, to impact cost that way. Another way to sort of think about those variables is if you think about there's overall cost of labor, which is one, and then there's like the cost of mistakes as another. And if you think about the intersection of those two and actually look at some of the examples that we see even outside of healthcare and extrapolate to what that could look like if we had actual like AI agents kind of doing jobs in healthcare, I think there's some interesting parallels there. And I actually hope that like companies do some research on this because I haven't yet seen anything on the data side with respect to what the impact could be.
What's an example?
Yeah, like an example, there's a lot of companies out there today that are doing things like an AI agent for sales, like an SDR basically. And some of the claims that those companies are making are, number one, that the cost of hiring an AI SDR is something on the order of like 5x cheaper than the human equivalent. And that's like a fully loaded cost on like salaries and benefits and overhead and all that kind of stuff. So that's point number one. Point number two is that they are more effective. They're actually, in some cases, like 2x more effective, meaning they just generate more leads for the companies, and they do it with much more qualification and much more effectiveness. So that's kind of lever number two. And then lever number three, which I think is really interesting to consider in healthcare, is the cost of ramp is much lower, right? So you can train an AI agent in 24 hours or whatever it might be, versus like a human rep, you might have to give them, 90 days before you even know whether or not they're a good fit. And so the iteration times, result in obviously a higher cost profile on the human side versus the AI side. And so I think if you extrapolate that model to what we're seeing, especially I would say on the administrative side of healthcare, imagine like a scheduling agent, AI, and you would hope that you would see sort of the same level of leverage along those lines. And to me, the cost of mistakes piece is the thing that's, I think, relatively unique in healthcare, where, again, the cost of a misdiagnosis or a cost of a incorrect triage, that's really what, is ballooning so many of the downstream costs.
But how do we account for that, right? Because the unit cost you could see directly in your P&L to some degree. I mean, these cost of mistakes, like how could you ever know?
Yeah, I mean, and arguably, going back to your value-based care point, like that is effectively what companies that are implementing value-based care are being measured to, is if you were to do a baseline look at the claims cost of a given population over a certain period of time and use that as your baseline benchmark, if you were to look at that same population prospectively post whatever intervention you're providing or whatever service you're providing, do you see a bend in the cost curve because you are presumably, getting ahead of those escalations? So I think we have the methodologies, to sort of measure these things, and they have yet to be applied holistically and comprehensively to the AI version of how these care models are being delivered. I think that's one of the huge levers that we hope to see.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, one of the darker things is that also the cost of people is related to the cost of healthcare.
Absolutely.
And so
it's basically the cost of healthcare. I mean, that's the biggest lever.
Yeah. So AI is going in the Moore's Law direction and healthcare is going the other one.
Yeah.
Sooner or later, AI is going to be way cheaper.
Yeah. The other dynamic, which we've talked about in the past, is, what you're starting to see is these, autonomous agents, as they're being sold into the healthcare system, people are saying, okay, one way I could look at this is it's a technology and, I should buy it out of my 10% sort of IT budget, so to speak. But then the other way I could look at this is like, this is actually a labor expense where I'm actually able to staff, a virtual call center or a virtual billing, team on the basis of these AI agents. And that could actually hit my labor spend budget, which obviously is, it's like 60% of the overall budget versus the 10% on the IT side. And so you all of a sudden have a lot more leverage to be able to deploy into these new modalities. And so I think that's going to be a big driver of the sea change of how we think about the cost impact, is if you're able to actually look at it as a labor expense, then obviously on a relative basis, it looks much more attractive.
So it's funny because I was mentioning this argument to somebody and he was saying, well, isn't that just accounting? And the funny thing is, like in healthcare, who's going to pay for it? It's like the first question you ask. And how it gets accounted in the P&L is huge.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's a really sort of foundational, fundamental thing.
Yeah, especially if for every dollar deployed, first of all, they have budgeted for it already. And so it's sort of like they would love to spend it on as many humans as they can, but there just aren't enough bodies to throw at the problem right now. But if for every dollar that they do spend, they end up getting, 5x better yield or whatever the leverage equation looks like in our world, then you can imagine, like, again, that they could probably spend half of that budget and still get, the same level of performance that they would otherwise get through humans. So there's a bigger pool of opportunity, I think, in that universe than there is on just the IT side.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Cool. Okay. So that was a great question, number one. Question number two is very profound.
Okay.
Someone asked, what are the big blockers in America to bringing down healthcare costs, and how can we resolve these? So when I first read this question, I said, if I knew the answer to this question, I would be in a different job. But then I realized if I knew the answer to the question, I'd be a venture capitalist and I would invest in health tech companies that were solving this. So what are some of your ideas on this?
Yeah, this is the deep, deep question. And I think, I think we can point to several different things. I mean, one is that the economics of healthcare is fundamentally inelastic. So let's say your spouse or your kid or your parents are sick. What would you pay to help them? And let's say maybe that's some new therapy which costs $1 million or whatever. You'd mortgage your house. All these things. That inelasticity is never going to change. And so I do worry that like healthcare is something where you could pour infinite money in, because what are the alternatives? Like, I'm going to get a child. I mean, that's not an alternative. So that we have to face and realize that it's not like buying soap or buying a car. Like, I'll just get another car or something like that. But then on top of that, though, I think it's the sort of false choice, and that hopefully doesn't even get anywhere close to that. And that's the sick care versus sort of prevention. If we get to the point where we're not forced to pay money in that way, that is, I think, how we bend the curve. People have been talking about this for a long time, right? I mean, prevention is something you can say, but how do you get it done? And how do you change behavior? Those are things that we hope AI and tech will be able to do, but we're just starting to see little baby steps on that. But without that, I think we're in sick care and we're in the inelastic regime, and it's just going to be everything.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and what you're speaking to as well is sort of one of the reasons that our healthcare costs are so high is that there is an infinite number of things that we can do, as a society to provide, services to people who need them, whether they are sick or whether they are in a more of a preventative state. And, I think it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, which is, the biggest component of the driver of that cost is labor today. And tautologically speaking, like AI is, therefore, potentially one of the biggest levers to reducing the cost of care delivery in our country per everything that we just talked about. I mean, the other thing is just product innovation, right? I mean, the other way that we can drive cost structure reduction is taking things that today are done through individual human bespoke services and trying to productize them, whether in the form of a diagnostic, whether in the form of a drug, something that doesn't require coaches to drive behavior change, but rather something that I could just pop as a pill to drive the same level of outcomes. And so that's where, I think the aperture broadens in terms of the potential impact of AI, even on the drug discovery side and everything that we're seeing in that universe, let alone on the diagnostic side and everything else. So it seems on the one hand like an intractable problem, but I think if you were to boil it down to, really the 2 or 3 things that drive the majority of the cost bloat that we see in our system, then you could very easily tie it back to a lot of the AI opportunity that we're talking about.
Kind of what's interesting about your approach, your idea is that you're taking this infinite demand and you're combining it with a zero cost.
Yeah.
There you go. And so that's the
We've
solution.
solved it.
That's the solution. And so the nice thing about the exponentials is that, things will go down a factor of 1,000 like every 10 years on the Moore's Law side, and we'll continue to see that. So 1,000, maybe in 20 years, 1,000,000, 1,000 times 1,000, that's essentially going to zero. It's kind of amazing to think of a world where healthcare services are like, we have all these free services on the internet and so on right now. If it gets that way, that may be the type of thing that can address that. But right now, that sounds like science fiction, but 20 years is a long time.
Yeah. And also, I mean, the other argument to make is that if we were paying as much as we are paying and getting commensurate value, then maybe we wouldn't be complaining so much, right? I think the complaint is because we are spending so much and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And so part of it also comes back to like the efficacy of these AI products that we're deploying. Like that has to be obviously true and clear and measurable. So again, like I would not mind paying more if we were getting more value out of the system, but clearly that's not been the case.
Yeah, I also have a suspicion about the complaining part in that when I'm personally paying, right, then then it's one thing versus like, my employer is paying into this plan and the plan pays or not pays. It's so convoluted that it's not even sure like who's paying and who's responsible. That's another complexity of it.
Totally. Yeah. And that's like the final thing we should say on this is that obviously a huge part of why costs have gone up in healthcare is just a pure artifact of the third-party payer system. And we've talked a lot about how just the mere nature of how those contracts get negotiated. There's no tethering to the reality of the actual cost structure of care delivery, nor the value in most cases. And so, that's something that going back to whether it's, value-based care in its purest form or some type of payment reform of the actual model by which care gets paid for it, like that's going to be a critical part of it too.
Or even just like giving agency to the patient, like something like ICHRA where you feel like I'm picking the plan.
Yes.
I'm making the plan. I'm paying for it since I have some money that was given to me. That I think could change psychology.
100%. Yeah, and consumers are now a major payer, right? And just in terms of the portion of the healthcare dollar that is being paid out of pocket. And so I do think that's going to be a factor as well. Yep.
Okay, well, do we solve this thing or not? Like,
we are solving it by way of the companies that we're partnering with, but I think we at least boiled it down to the driving components that we think you can influence through the current wave of technology.
Do make it hard, right? I mean, I think that's kind of, it's more about like, I think what we're describing is possible, but obviously there's a lot to do.
Yes, absolutely. So speaking of financial incentives and humans, a third question that came in around cost related to AI was, the real barrier to AI adoption is the human element. So without financial incentives for doctors to adopt AI, they seem less likely to do so. Is there a way to solve this? Is there a technical innovation that could be offered as a service to providers, insurance companies, and drug companies to create an incentive to adopt AI and move towards maximizing patient outcomes? There's a lot there, but basically it's asking, can financial incentives play a role in adoption of AI, given that there are some barriers to entry?
Yeah. I mean, so there's some things that are obvious, right? So on the back office, I like, a GP, I'm sure would love to have AI taking care of all that and all the forms and all the BS that they have to deal with. I think back office is an easy win. And I would think they would adopt it, and that's alignment. If AI on the clinical side or even an AI co-pilot, that gets a little trickier, right? And I think the question is, how do they see the benefits of it? Because they may feel like they're doing things differently, and anything different may feel risky, even if it's less risky. Just different is different. And so I would love to find a way to align it. I mean, it again, like harps back to like if the doctor's at risk, and then this thing can actually decrease costs by catching things. That's going to be pretty exciting, right? Yeah. And so that's a very natural thing. I don't know if we're going to see more providers go at risk. But if they do, I would want to have, if I was at risk as a provider, I'd want to have all the tools I could to make sure I do the most.
Yeah. There's an emotional element to this too. Like I think financial incentives is one thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's certainly in the way that our healthcare system is designed today that even using the lever of financial incentives actually moves the needle for the individual clinician who is not necessarily like directly in the payments flow or privy even to the cost of any of the services that they're delivering. And so what I've seen actually more materially is the emotional aspect of when you give them a magical tool that not only transforms their workflow, but also creates a magical experience for the patient, that in of itself is something that they go home and like brag about, right? Yeah. And so I do think that with like the current wave of ambient scribe tools, like that's what we're seeing, right? All these testimonials are just unbelievable and very indexed on emotion of these doctors saying, for the first time, I feel like I love practicing medicine because you've now taken all this BS work off my plate and I can go home and not have to, do the pajama time thing and chart all my patients like after my kids go to sleep or whatever. So I do think that, we should acknowledge that it's not just financial incentives. It's probably a combination of that plus just the emotional element. We're actually seeing this where different hospitals and provider groups are touting the fact that they offer these AI tools to their staff.
Sure.
And that's a way to recruit talent. And I think that's a really interesting angle to this as well, of like just retention and like, people being able to enjoy their jobs and being attracted to different organizations that they think are forward thinking in terms of deploying this kind of technology. So I personally think that it's probably going to be more these soft things in the near term that drive adoption, at least for clinicians. And then, perhaps if you're able to layer on a financial element to it, it could just be icing on the cake. Yeah.
That's a good point, because I think people don't go into medicine to optimize their salary.
Yeah.
They want to be doctors. They want to treat patients.
Yeah.
So that element makes sense.
Maybe it's both in the long run, but
well, I mean, it has to be both. But I think your point of they're not going to just make changes purely and sort of financially based.
Yeah. Cool.
But so actually then drives the question, like, how does the word get out that this actually changes their lives? It's
kind of happening. Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's some virality already associated with it.
But it has to be magical. That's your point. It's not 10% better. It has to be like 10x.
Yeah. So I think we are seeing that with these scribing tools. I think, even like some of the more modern, like clinical decision support tools that are sort of a co-pilot for the doctor and able to basically ascribe a nation's worth of specialist intelligence, sort of in one statement and one chatbot that any doctor can access for any given patient at the point of care. Like, there are these things that are, I think, an order of magnitude better than sort of the status quo. Yeah. And also, again, just like if I see my doctor using this thing, I'll be like, oh my gosh, that is like so amazing. And my feelings towards that clinician are probably going to, increase in terms of my receptivity.
Yeah, it can feel like a superpower.
Exactly. So Iron Man suits for doctors, as we've heard from some founders. Yes. Yeah. And then, the last thing is just boiling it back down to the original question on the financial incentives, and maybe another question to pose to you, Vijay, is like, how do you think about, at the end of the day, like if we're able to reimburse doctors for the use of these tools, like that's one sort of blunt instrument way to solve it. And we always talk about if an AI product can sort of ride the existing reimbursement rails of our system, then that's in some ways like the smoothest way to get in. And this begs the question of, do we think AI agents, like clinical agents in healthcare, will be regulated as diagnostics, like an FDA regulated diagnostic, or as an actual clinician who needs to be like credentialed and licensed and
which
board
that
certified?
Doesn't exist, right? And that's not even ONC, right? That's
totally no. That would be an entirely new rail.
Yeah. The latter probably would make sense in time, but we're nowhere close to that now, right? So it's probably somewhere ONC-ish in terms of software. But the diagnostic part, if you're making a diagnosis, perhaps that might be on the FDA software as a device or something like that. But I think you're pointing out the point, which is that we're into new territory. Yeah. Where it's unclear how to think about it. But this isn't unique to doctors. Like, AI is going to do a bunch of things like that require credentialing. And so like an AI as a teacher, is that going to have to be credentialed or so on? And so that gets very interesting.
Yeah. I think, the distinction between the diagnostic approval pathway versus like a human clinician pathway, there's a very long pull there, right? Because like at least the diagnostics are very atomic in terms of the, actual like analytes that they're measuring and the type of diagnosis that they're making. Whereas I think the magic of some of these agents is that they are much more holistic and comprehensive in terms of information synthesis and, coming up with multiple hypotheses about what might be going on with the patient. So we're definitely in uncharted territory. But I think the answer to this question will dictate, I think, a lot of how the financial rails work around these products.
Well, thinking out loud, would it be convincing to you, and these tests, like if AI did well on medical exams? Yeah. Like, let's say we tested exactly like we tested people. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, and I think I think it's a great forcing function for people to ask that same question of humans, frankly.
Yeah, that's right, too.
Because even if you pass the boards, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a great clinician. Yeah. And the world of knowledge is always changing every single day. And how do you keep up with that? We're seeing this a lot with like a lot of these companies sort of pushing the boundaries of how we define compliance, how we define safety, how we define regulation, is that it's actually causing us to like hold up a mirror to ourselves and say like, okay, if we're going to hold AI to that bar, we also need to be holding ourselves to the same bar. And, how do we reconcile that? So it's a very existential question.
Well,
I think.
It's also one that I think it's hard to be purely logical about often because like, the self-driving car argument that once self-driving cars are statistically safer than people, then you're letting people die by not allowing self-driving cars.
Exactly.
But then the moment a self-driving car kills someone, even if it's like 1/10 as common as a person killing someone, which unfortunately happens, it'll still have this stigma of the AI killed someone.
Yeah, the bar is different.
Yeah, so I think the bar is different. This might be the magic has to get to 10x, something where 10% is probably within noise and without doubt or something like that. But 10x is kind of the thing where like, okay.
Yeah.
Like we have to think of things differently now.
The next set of questions that we got from the audience were about data. And so the first question here was, how do we get as many companies as possible to share data, positive and negative, including research and development, to drive AI forward?
Yeah, so first off is like, so do we want people to share data?
Yeah.
I'm curious to sort of even poke at, because there's an assumption in there, and so I think we want AI to be developed. Sharing data feels very natural, but like I think there's just a lot of data, and do you want your data shared and all these things? So, and also I think there'll be questions of, like all these stock photos that are being shared, so to speak. People want copyright information for it. Like, so data is going to become very valuable. And how do people think about that value, I think, is going to be tricky. And who's going to want to claim that value? Presumably the people who own the data or have the data will be that, which will be maybe the providers. But like, is it really their data?
Yeah, exactly.
And so how the economics of that works out is actually pretty complicated. The alternative, which I think is going to happen instead, is that we're going to see data generated for AI right now. So instead of looking backwards, which has to go through the EMRs and all these things, which are maybe not the best thing to train AI out of anyways, you can take another page out of self-driving cars where Tesla has people driving around and they're essentially training the AI. You can imagine having all caregivers being some form of RLHF to a model that's kind of learning from them and paying attention to all that stuff. And maybe the going forward part is perhaps more interesting than the looking backward part.
I 100% agree.
And I think that might be better data for AI.
Yeah, exactly. And we touched upon this in the last conversation we had, which was the, EHRs are at best a highly abstract, representation of patient journeys. At worst, just sporadic encounter-related data that really does not capture the essence of what's happening with that individual.
Yeah.
And so, whereas there are obviously companies that are focused on helping organizations like hospital systems monetize their data assets, and I do think there's a role for that, and they're doing it in a way that respects data privacy and security and consent from patients whose data are being put into these troves. But at the same time, there are huge gaps in data that need to be filled, and I think that's a lot of the great work that many of the companies in our portfolio are doing. Is how do we actually produce new data sets to inform, number one, like a better representation of real life and real biology and real patient journeys, but also ones that are much more conducive to actual training of models because they are more representative of what's going on.
Well, you can imagine a services company that's providing some sort of healthcare service. It's training AI with its workers. And then the easy things, which are probably the boring things anyways, AI starts to do. And then the more interesting, complicated things probably still go to people. And then in time, you need fewer and fewer people, and they're doing more and more interesting things. And eventually, the services company becomes an AI company.
Yeah. And actually, so I think that the next question here is, do we think that legacy healthcare companies have a data advantage in the age of AI?
Yeah, actually, the sort of spicy take on it is maybe not as much as they think.
Yeah.
Because the temptation is the data's there, and this may be true for pharma too, may be true for payer providers, that data, there's a lot of it, but it might not be as good as the data that will be generated.
But they do have the largest labor force that could be the RLHFers to, then use prospective tools to generate new data.
And the combination might be like really overwhelming, so that could be interesting too.
Yeah. I agree with that even though seemingly they should be best poised to have a data advantage in this universe, I think the specific nature of the types of data that have historically been stored in these systems that were very much designed for like different purposes sort of missed the point.
I think it's also not to be underestimated the cultural sort of differences between like an AI company and a more traditional services company. And getting one to be the other, is like getting a boat to be an airplane sometimes. It might be pretty hard. And so it might be something that would be hard for incumbents to do, even with the technology, just in terms of the culture.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that was on the data side. The last bulk of questions that we had here were about our consumer experience, patient experience. So what do we think is the optimal balance between AI-driven recommendations and clinician expertise?
The way I think about this is that there are all these things computers do today that like they couldn't do some time ago, but we would never trust a person to do today. So like a simple example is like TurboTax or something like that. I remember watching my dad do the taxes when I was a kid, and he did it all by hand with a calculator. And like, my God, if you had to change one number, like you didn't even have a spreadsheet. I mean, this was a calculator, And so But no one's going to doubt that. I mean, because I don't think I know the taxes better than it does. And so it might make mistakes, but what I know? I think we'll get to that point where medicine will be about incorporating all this data about me as a patient, data about everyone else that's like me, to be able to draw the best conclusions. That's something that is just a computer problem. Mm-hmm. And that, much like we saw in finance, like it went from being a person problem to a data problem. I think we'll see that here too. But even in finance, there's still plenty of people in finance. It's not like there's just one computer and you talk to the computer. And so the interfacing and the service and the connection will be key. I think the connection is not just us being touchy-feely wet things, so that then talk to the oracle that knows everything. It's also, I think, having a human in the loop for their sensibility of it, because it could be that the best thing from data science point of view is a little more complicated in the context of someone's life, and so on. Yeah. And so what we think of now as RLHF onto training a model would be sort of still important for someone to be there to make sure that we're doing the what we want to do from the bigger picture. Yep. And that's actually a little harder to code. Yeah.
And we're seeing like actual examples of this in the wild right now, right? So we have, and I think a lot of the way that these tools manifest is about choice, where you're giving the doctor the choice of whether to use the automatically produced answer to the question that they can then curate and put in their own voice. But, they can choose to override it and say, I'm going to provide the answer that I believe is right, that's different from what the AI produced, or they can take what the AI produced and, add to it and make it their own. So I think the choice piece for the doctor is one thing. And then we've been using a bunch of the tools out there that are designed for consumers to engage with an AI-powered, medical group or medical clinician. And in those cases, it's really interesting because they're giving choice. They're saying, consumer, you can either ask the AI the question, and by the way, you can also forward the answer to that question to the actual doctor if you choose. Or you can just initiate a conversation with the doctor, and the doctor himself or herself is also using those AI tools in the background. A lot of it, I think, is just choice, and just like in any other, aspect of our life where you have a choice between like the self-serve option versus like the concierge version, and you could even like price discriminate based on that if you want higher level of service, whatever it is. I think that's like one of the more magical elements here is that for rote questions today, you sort of have to rely on like the human being on the other side of the phone line when you call to like answer any and all questions that you have. We used to look at, in my startup, we worked a lot with call centers for hospitals, and it was something on the order of like 30 to 40% of all inbound calls were things that just required a lookup and didn't require a human, but we queued up these, millions of patients who were calling every year just to answer those really basic questions. Whereas in this new modality, you can give them that choice to say, okay, try it first in the self-service automated way. And then if you can't get your answer, you can go to the doctor. So I think choice is a big part of it.
Yeah, I could also imagine the sort of patient experience could be vaguely analogous to like when you get airline tickets, like you could call up and that person could use the computer to book the tickets, or you could use your computer 100%. To book the tickets. And like, I'd rather drive it myself. That gives huge agency that I'm sort of the one sort of thinking and doing. And that actually, just from a patient experience perspective, is very different.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it's also disclosure, right? I think people are suspicious when you don't know whether it's an AI or a human. So I think it's really important. And, again, all the best in class companies are doing this where they will disclose up front whether or not you're talking to an AI versus a real human. And it's remarkable. Like we were talking earlier about, like companies like Hippocratic, when you like listen to some of these calls, it's remarkable how many people will choose to talk to the AI, and also just how much more engaging those AIs are and how much more they're willing to share. And in some cases,
people can share to the AI.
Yeah, and also sometimes they just forget they're talking to an AI because the voice modality has gotten so good. So I think for me, it's like choice and disclosure are two important things, and it doesn't have to be binary either way. But that's really the unlock that we're seeing. A second question that came in on the patient experience side kind of relates to what we're just talking about. Is there a part of care that will always require a human expert? And what is that?
Yeah, I think there probably will be for a while, but I think it will get more and more diminished. I think we'll see like these nurse lines or something like that. You can imagine that could be something that could be replaced in other nursing duties. You start from like subclinical into simple clinical. Something like neurosurgery, that might be. Or
you never know. We might have robotic.
I think
AI robots.
Well, and the one thing about neurosurgery in particular, as an example, or heart surgery, cardiology, and so on, it's often very patient specific. So you have to map it out. But right now, that's hard for a computer. Maybe then that flips, where you have the right imaging and the computer can get all the right details, and like an autopilot or something like that. So Yeah, I think we've said this before. The part that I think is really hard for us to internalize is what gets done in 20 years or even 10 years. You look at computers 20 years ago, like iPhone didn't exist, like the internet was barely out, it was 2004, like the world was very different. And so I think we're going to see it gradually where first it's some bits of nursing, then more of nursing, then some bits of a GP, then maybe some bits of a specialist, and maybe certain specialists like neurology or something like that, where it's about prescribing drugs based on the patient's diagnosing a patient. You'll see more and more of that. And then eventually, I think it will be fewer and fewer things. Will there ever be zero people? It's hard to imagine. I don't think there's any place where there's zero people. Like, even you look at like a factory, there's still people in the factory.
Yeah.
There's some people to mind the machines and to make sure that they're doing the right thing, and for us to keep an eye on things.
And it kind of goes back to what you said earlier, which I agree with. It's like the exception cases that, you probably always want to have a backstop of a human to either try to answer it themselves or, override the system in some way. So I think at least for the foreseeable future, exception handling, I think will always require the human input.
Like there are all these jobs that required lots of people that have already been replaced by machines. And we're not really regretting that because like it's smart.
It gives us leverage.
It gives us leverage. Yeah. And so it would be weird to go out there and see people like doing things by hand, and so I think we're just gradually going to shift over into that type of world.
Yep, absolutely. Great. And then the last question that came in on the patient side. So personalized and preventative health is becoming more effective. How significantly will this influence healthcare, and how quickly? Does AI play a role in shaping this? If so, how personalized do you envision AI-enabled care to be? Is it at the individual level, at the disease level, or at the population level?
Yeah, I think the obvious thing is that it'll be at the individual level in this second. Like it has my wearables, it has my everything, it has my cortisol levels or whatever. And like it's individualized to the second. But, what does individualized really mean? It means that probably out of 7 billion people, there's going to be a bunch of phenotypes, and it has to map you to a phenotype and then see what's appropriate for that phenotype. Right. But there could be like 1,000 phenotypes or something like that.
Or a million.
A million, yeah. So it could be a lot. And so just even being able to map you to a phenotype is a huge diagnostic tool.
Yeah. And so, arguably everything that's wrong with healthcare is because it is done at the population health level, because it's inherently then designed for like least common denominator, and therefore like the majority of people aren't actually being accommodated in whatever. Yeah,
because your personal baseline could be very different than the population baseline. And so deviation from personal baseline could be actually not a significant deviation from the population baseline, but still would be significant for your health.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's actually a very natural one. And I think that's the part that's exciting. It's the part that it could do really well because it could pay infinite attention to each one of us. And maybe one of the questions is, where would be the first big wins? Like if you go back 20 years, there's all this big hope about like precision medicine, and typically with genomics or maybe with oncology or something like that. And I think genomics had signal, but not as much signal as I think people were hoping for. Maybe, and the hope now is that all these other things we can measure would be the signal. But that's, I think, kind of what's missing, right? Because without the data, the AI can't really understand which phenotype you are, and then we're stuck.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, but I do think that there are pockets of what happened in precision medicine that are great examples of what could be if you were able to get additional signal. The way that we characterize tumors these days, right? Lung cancer is not lung cancer. Lung cancer is 7 different kinds of cancer that all have different genomic signatures, and that like very much informs and has super high utility with respect to treatment decisions. So you could imagine if you were to instrument every human for dozens of additional physiological criteria or whatever it might be, even behavioral profiles, if you could replicate what we've already done to some degree with the genomic profiling that we do in oncology, imagine what that could be. Yeah,
that's very natural, very, very natural. But okay, so what's the barrier? Is it time? Or do we need to measure more things? What gets us from here to there?
Yeah, it's really signal to noise filtering. But both, the instrumentation piece, we're just in the early innings of figuring out like what devices we're putting on ourselves to measure what and how precise are they. And then combining that also with, again, like behavioral data, self-reported information. I think we still have a lot of sort of instrumentation to do to just produce the right data sets. And then, yet another wave of things to do, which is, again, where AI can come into play to figure out like what signal actually has utility in all of this.
That's really good. Yeah. And then actually these things aren't just like a fad, but we can say, actually, if you measure this, you can actually do that. Yeah,
but there's actionability associated with it. But again, we have the great examples of what have happened in precision medicine as kind of a precursor to that.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you to the audience for all their questions, and please reach out to us if you have more and help us design what the next conversation will look like.
Yep.
Thanks, Vijay.
That sounds fun. Thank you all.